To what extent did the revolution affect Nicaraguan politics, economics, and society? Sandinistas began major political and economic changes in the country almost immediately, dominating the junta and other governmental bodies until they ruled openly. Social changes were also implemented, and the status of women was affected as a result. Many historians argue that the real revolution in Nicaragua began with the departure of Somoza and the implementation of these changes. The most violent period of the Nicaraguan Revolution was from September 1978 until the collapse of the National Guard and its surrender on July 19, 1979. While estimates vary, perhaps 600 Sandinistas were killed in this year of violence, and somewhere between 200 and 300 National Guard. Fighting between the two groups killed between 9,000 and 50,000 civilians, according to various sources. The smaller of these numbers is argued by those authors who believe that the relatively small types of weapons used could not have led to a high death toll. These weapons were rifles, grenades, and so forth. Advocates of the higher death toll indicate that this was the result of attacks by National Guard tanks and planes on civilian populations. Regardless of the civilian death toll, the total number of combatants was small. The Sandinistas never had more than 3,000 fighters, and the National Guard numbered 10,000 at its greatest strength. Civilians were simply caught between these two groups, mostly in 1979. Somoza was eventually killed by a pro-Sandinista group in 1979 in Paraguay, where he had moved after a brief stay in the United States. Archbishop Orlando had been a prominent opponent of Somoza after 1974 at the height of corruption and scandal as a result of the Managua earthquake rebuilding efforts. He was a mediator between rebel groups during the Christmas party raid and the seizure of the National Palace by Sandinistas. Marxism opposed religion generally since it was seen as a fabricated system to control the masses. This necessarily meant that Marxists and their communist and socialist derivatives opposed the Catholic Church and vice versa. Nevertheless, by 1979, Orlando went so far as to accept the military changes of the Sandinistas as necessary in order to rid the country of Somoza and his regime. He also supported the Sandinistas by explaining to Nicaraguans that they should not necessarily fear socialism. But by the early 1980s, he was in opposition to the Sandinista government, which supported liberation theology and therefore interfered with the Catholic Church. Liberation theology was a Central American Catholic clergy movement, inspiring parishioners to work for change in this life rather than waiting for their reward in heaven. Several Catholic priests were members of the Sandinista movement, and they supported liberation theology. This set of beliefs was quite complex, but did emphasize the practice of religion instead of religious belief. It also promoted the idea that the structure of the Catholic Church, where all authority came from the Pope to cardinals and archbishops to bishops to priests, and from there to everyone else, was essentially backwards. Where there were few or no priests, Catholics who believed in liberation theology believed that regular people, such as peasants, could conduct their own religious services, including Mass, on their own without the need for a priest. Orlando and the Catholic Church as a whole condemned these views, seeing in them influences from Marxism. In order to limit Marxist influence on Catholics, Orlando forbade any Catholic priest from participating in the government and eventually expelled a prominent priest who was a member of the government from his religious order. Pope John Paul II visited Nicaragua in 1983 to shore up support for Catholics and the Catholic Church at a time when the Sandinistas were moving closer to communist nations diplomatically. Orlando, who became a cardinal in 1985, continued to be a popular leader with most Nicaraguans, speaking out against Sandinista human rights violations and various injustices as he saw them. He remains head of the Catholic Church in Nicaragua today. Major changes occurred in Nicaragua almost immediately after Somoza left the country in July 1979. These changes affected all social and economic classes in the country and even led to further fighting over a 10-year period. Almost immediately, it was clear that the Junta for National Reconstruction was being sidelined, with the Sandinistas making most of the decisions. Agreements worked out in Costa Rica just before the fall of Somoza about how the government would operate were simply ignored. The Sandinistas, for example, moved into properties owned by Somoza and his allies, including government buildings, and used them for their own purpose, such as a party headquarters. These properties technically belonged to the government and not just the Sandinistas, who were supposed to be only part of the ruling coalition. The Sandinistas also assumed the responsibility of building a new army, the Sandinista Popular Army, with much help from Cuba, again ignoring the junta and its ministers of defense. They also formed defense committees, which were groups organized in neighborhoods, districts, and regions throughout the country that could try to get people involved in Sandinista activities. This move made them a party with mass support that could mobilize tens of thousands of people in a brief period of time for any actions that the Sandinistas desired. Violeta Chamorro and Rubella resigned from the five-member junta in April 1980, protesting Sandinista domination of the government and violation of agreements arranged in mid-July 1979. The main violation was the refusal of the Sandinistas to set dates or structures for new elections, while taking more and more control over government institutions. Sandinistas found two cooperative conservative politicians to join the junta and others to join the Consultative Council, but in reality, the Sandinistas had a majority in both bodies and managed the state. Elections were finally organized and held in 1984, with the Sandinista FSLN party garnering 76% of the vote, electing Daniel Ortega as president of Nicaragua. In 1990, a coalition of parties would unseat Ortega, with Chamorro becoming the first elected woman leader in North or South America. The Marxist leanings of the Sandinistas emerged very quickly in terms of economic policy. All foreign trade and banks were nationalized. All insurance companies and mining companies, as well as mines, were nationalized. Only the government could export agricultural products. All Somoza family property was seized by the state, including businesses and vast amounts of agricultural land, houses, and cars. Up to 30% of business owners fled the country with their money within weeks of the Sandinista takeover, fearing the confiscation of their property. Remaining business owners were unwilling to import new merchandise to sell or invest in their businesses for fear that they too would have their property seized. COSIP, the Association of Business Owners, now referred to as COSEP, after a name change, protested government seizures, stating that they violated the plan that the junta had outlawed in Costa Rica in mid-July. At the end of September, the Sandinistas held a large gathering of their members, forming the Sandinista Assembly, a group of 27 representatives from each of the three factions. They created a document that explained that they did not want to establish a Marxist state, but gradually would. This alarmed the business community and many foreign nations. Within a year, 40% of the nation's economy was under the control of the Sandinista-dominated government. All land owned by Somoza and his allies was confiscated. This included 1/4 of all farmland in the nation. By 1984, the Sandinistas had confiscated 2.75 million acres of land from those that it said had cooperated with the Somoza regime. This was 1/3 of all farmland. Larger farms were just turned into state enterprises, usually employing the same farm workers that had toiled for the large landowners. Most of these workers saw little difference between the old system and the new, since the government still dictated what was planted. In 1983 and 84, the government changed this policy of large state farms and began to give land to small groups of peasants who worked in cooperatives, or even to individuals to counteract the activities of the Contras. The Contras were various counter-revolutionary groups who fought against the Sandinistas in the 1980s. In the end, this gave 1/3 of the rural population their own land to farm. Support for the Contras often came from peasants who wanted to have their own land and from farmers who feared the Sandinista government would seize their property. While the economy was being addressed by Sandinistas, human rights violations took place. The Nicaraguan Permanent Commission for Human Rights, which had documented Somoza's National Guard violations against the Sandinistas, now documented the Sandinistas' violations. Many former National Guardsmen were imprisoned and put on trial for collaboration with the Somoza regime, along with some members of their families and others that the Sandinistas thought might have associated with the National Guards. It is estimated that about 7,500 people, mostly men, were imprisoned by the Sandinistas. Hundreds of others disappeared after being arrested and were never seen again. In at least some areas, mass graves were found, including some near the city of Granada. Hundreds may have been executed and buried this way. Within 3 months of coming to power, the Sandinistas abolished the Permanent Commission for Human Rights. The Sandinista-dominated government also worked to limit freedom of speech by censoring the press and limiting public debate on their policies and programs. Using university and secondary school students as well as Nicaraguan, Cuban, and Costa Rican teachers, the Sandinista-dominated government began the National Literacy Crusade. This effort was meant to eradicate illiteracy in Nicaragua. It was estimated that just over 50% of the population was unable to read or write in March 1980. The government announced in August that the campaign had concluded. Illiteracy was now just under 13% of the population, a remarkable result. Over 90% of people taught over 400,000 people to read. Within the next 10 years, over 1.6 million people were taught to read and write through continued education efforts in rural districts. The government mass-printed inexpensive books, including the writings of Sandino and other Sandinista-approved authors, adding a political dimension to the education campaign. The campaign brought many educated people from the urban areas into impoverished rural villages for the first time, making an impression on many about the living conditions for the poor. Nicaragua's efforts to eradicate illiteracy were acknowledged by the United Nations. Before 1979, the condition of women in Nicaragua was poor. 93% of rural women were illiterate. 20% of girls attended secondary school. Most of these lived in urban areas. 75% of women with children were not married. 48% of all households had women as the primary income earners. Over 10% of all children died in infancy as a result of malnutrition. And rural women had practically no health care or education. Under Somoza, by law, a husband could take the salary of his wife and had legal control over any children. Men could also divorce women if women committed adultery in marriage, but there was no such laws penalizing men for the same act. Women were culturally expected to be subservient and, other than farm work, they were primarily servants, except in the small, middle, and upper economic classes. Women had practically no legal rights and were neglected by the state. Sandinistas, perhaps because of their Marxist background, which promoted social and economic equality for all people, welcomed women in the movement for the most part. Approximately 30% of all Sandinista members were women by mid-1979. Women fought in guerrilla units, some forming all-female battalions, as well as working as organizers, operating communication systems, and serving as officers, even over men. After the Sandinistas came to power, campaigns to promote literacy and improve health care affected women all over the country, leading to longer and healthier lives for them and their children. The junta, just after the fall of Somoza, announced the equality of men and women as law. Other laws forbade media to promote women as objects of desire, allowed maternity leave, divorce by women from their husbands, and full equality for all children, regardless of whether or not their parents were married. They also outlawed husbands from collecting the salaries of their wives. Women in Nicaragua in the 1980s were able to leave the traditional roles of farming and being servants. The small numbers of middle and upper economic class women were soon joined by growing numbers of women from rural areas who joined in improving the status of women throughout the country. 60% of all those teaching peasants to read were women. Over 75% of the people working to improve healthcare in rural regions were women. Over 30% of all management positions in the government were held by women by 1987. 30% of the leadership positions in the Sandinista organization were held by women. Women comprised 37% of workers in industry. While women's lives improved remarkably under the Sandinistas, they were still paid less than men and faced discrimination that was illegal but still tolerated, as in many other countries. Some of the government's initial enthusiasm and special programs were tempered or put on hold during the war with the Contras, which sapped the state's economic resources. The Sandinista government apparently did not wish to cause potential social divisions, while unity was needed during the war. A week after Somoza fled Nicaragua, the Sandinistas accepted Cuban assistance. Hundreds of teachers, doctors, nurses, and engineers arrived, with numbers reaching into the thousands in a few months. Cuba also sent military advisors and personnel. Nicaraguan university students suddenly received scholarships to study in Cuba, and over 1,500 Nicaraguan school children were sent to special schools set up for them. Over 1,000 Cuban teachers moved into rural areas where no teachers were present, helping to establish a mass literacy campaign. While the Sandinistas claimed they were grateful for Panama's help during the revolution, Panama was soon ignored as relations with communist Cuba grew stronger, a relationship which dismayed the U.S. government. There was a fear that the Sandinistas would assist rebel groups in other Central American states, such as El Salvador. Military aid was sent from the Sandinistas to Marxist-leaning rebels in El Salvador starting in the mid-1980, confirming U.S. fears. Many Sandinista leaders verbally attacked the U.S. in speeches, blaming the U.S. for inflicting Somoza and his regime on them. They believed that the U.S. was responsible for Nicaragua's poverty, and it should compensate them with grants and loans. The U.S. State Department, fearing the growing influence of Cuba, asked the U.S. Congress for $75 million in emergency aid in November 1979, most of which would be a loan. After many months, the U.S. government finally approved the aid, which stipulated that the U.S. president could cancel the loan at any moment and demand full repayment. There was also a warning that it would be canceled if the Sandinistas assisted rebel groups in any other nation. Meanwhile, Cuba poured thousands of people into the country to help concrete ways. When the Sandinistas failed to follow through with a promise to have national elections, the U.S. ended its financial support for the new government. Groups began to mobilize against the Sandinistas almost immediately. The president at the time was Carter, but Reagan was still to come. This would create a 10-year civil war and quite a few illegal activities from the executive branch of our government.